If you saw a helpless baby fighting for its life in a river, would you risk your own to save it even if that baby had claws and fangs? Susan Everett didn't pause to ask that question. The moment she heard the frantic splashing and the piercing cry, she dropped everything and ran, heart hammering in her chest. At 64, she didn't move as fast as she once did, but grief has a way of making people reckless, or maybe brave. Her boots sank into the mud as she pushed through the reeds, not knowing that her life was about to change forever. Just 8 months earlier, Susan had buried her husband of 42 years. Dave had been her anchor, her best friend, and the only person who truly understood her quiet love for animals and silence. When cancer took him, it left behind a widow who no longer recognized her reflection. She ate dinner in silence. She walked the halls of their Minnesota home like a ghost. Her children worried, but Susan told them she just needed time. What she didn't say was that she wasn't sure she wanted that time at all. She booked the trip to Kenya on a whim, a half-hearted attempt at honoring the promise they'd made decades ago to see the world together. Now she was seeing it alone. Her safari group had scattered for the afternoon, the guide gone to fix the Jeep, and Susan sat by the river with her journal open and nothing to write. She thought she'd feel something, wonder, awe, maybe even peace. But mostly, she felt the same emptiness that had followed her across oceans. Then came the cry, not human, not bird, something raw and panicked, just upstream. She dropped her pen, squinting through the high grass, a flash of movement, then a splash. And then she saw it, small, golden, and struggling against the current. A lion cub, no more than a few months old. Its paws flailed above the water as it was swept toward the rocks. It would drown within seconds. Susan didn't think, she just moved. She kicked off her sandals and stepped into the freezing water, gasping as it pulled at her legs. She had no plan, no backup, just instinct and something inside her aching to matter again. The current was stronger than it looked. She slipped once, her knee slamming into a stone, but she kept going. The cub was seconds from going under when her hands found its soaked fur. It hissed and clawed, but Susan didn't let go. She cradled it against her chest and fought her way back to shore, legs trembling, lungs burning. When she collapsed onto the bank, the cub was shivering, but alive. Its body was warmer than she expected. Its fur smelled like wet hay and fear. Susan held it close, tears stinging her eyes. For the first time in months, she had done something that mattered. Blood trickled from her arm where its tiny claws had scratched her, but she didn't notice. She was whispering softly, more to herself than to the animal. "You're okay now. You're safe." The cub's breathing slowed. Its eyes wide and golden locked with hers for just a moment. That was when she heard the sound behind her, low, deep, ancient. She froze. Slowly, she turned her head. The grass behind her shifted, and out of the shadows stepped a full-grown lioness, her body impossibly large, her eyes sharp with focus. Susan's breath caught. 2 more females appeared beside her, and behind them, a male lion, his mane rippling like fire in the late sun. The cub gave a faint cry in her arms. The pride had come. Susan couldn't move. She didn't scream or run. She simply looked at the lioness and waited. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, but her hands remained steady around the cub. The lioness was close enough now that Susan could see the scars across her nose, the dust on her whiskers. Everything in her told her to let go, but something else told her to hold on. Then, the lioness did something no one would believe. She sat down, calm, watchful. Her ears twitched, but she made no move to pounce. The cub whimpered again. Slowly, Susan unwrapped her jacket, revealing the tiny lion. The mother stepped forward, gently picked up her baby by the scruff, and with a quiet rumble, turned back toward the grass. The others followed. And just like that, Susan was alone again, but no longer empty. What happened next is something no wildlife expert, no guide, not even Susan herself could have predicted, and it's a moment that would move even the coldest heart to tears. Out there, alone in the wild, she wasn't just a retired teacher from Minnesota anymore. She had stepped into something ancient, something sacred, and the story wasn't over. Because just when she thought the lions were gone, something in the grass moved again, and this time, it wasn't the mother. For a moment, she thought it was over. The lioness had taken her cub and vanished into the golden haze of the savannah. Susan sat in stunned silence, her heart still galloping. Her body was soaked, muddy, and aching. But her mind was alive in a way it hadn't been since Dave took his last breath. She wanted to laugh and cry at the same time. Then, a sharp rustle behind her made her flinch. She turned and froze. The cub hadn't been alone. Just feet from where she had pulled the first one from the river, another tiny form was trembling in the reeds, half submerged, nearly invisible in the shadows, a second cub. This one was weaker, its cries faint. Susan gasped. It must have drifted separately, unnoticed in the chaos. And now, it was barely moving. She didn't think. Her legs, bruised and shaking, carried her forward once more. The mud sucked at her feet, the cold bit at her skin. But she reached the second cub, scooped it from the water, and held it close. It didn't resist, it couldn't. Its eyes were half-lidded, its body limp with exhaustion. She whispered softly, urgently, "Hold on, little one. I've got you." Somewhere behind her, she knew the pride was still watching. She didn't care. She couldn't let this one die. She stumbled back to the bank, pressing the cub gently to her chest. Her pulse thundered. The grass remained still. Maybe the lions had gone. Or maybe they were waiting. She didn't know what they would do if she kept this second cub for too long. But every instinct in her body screamed that this one wasn't strong enough to walk on its own. Susan made a decision she would question for the rest of her life. She zipped the cub into her field jacket, carefully, gently, and turned toward her tent. She would warm it, try it, and if it lived through the night, then she'd figure out what to do next. Her legs trembled beneath her as she moved, her senses raw and electric. Every rustle of grass felt like breath on her neck. Back in her tent, she placed the cub on a folded towel and wrapped it in dry cloth. Its breathing was shallow but steady. She lit a small fire and hovered beside it, refusing to sleep. Every so often, she reached out and touched its tiny paw, whispering stories about Dave, about Minnesota winters, about the robins in her backyard. It was absurd talking to a lion cub, but she didn't feel alone anymore. At dawn, the cub stirred. Its ears twitched. Its eyes opened only slightly but enough to meet hers. Susan wept quietly. "You made it," she whispered, voice cracking. It was still too weak to walk, but it was alive. And now she had a new dilemma. How do you return a baby lion to a wild pride without getting killed? She needed help. She couldn't risk leaving the cub alone, but she also couldn't call for assistance from her tent radio without drawing attention. Interfering with wildlife was illegal in the reserve, punishable by heavy fines, or worse. But leaving it to die, that wasn't something Susan could live with. So she made the only call she could. She radioed her guide, whispered that she needed help but begged him to come alone. No authorities, no rangers. "Just you," she said, voice urgent. "I have someone you need to see." And then she waited beside the fire, beside the cub, heart wide open, not knowing that the most extraordinary part of her story had yet to unfold. The guide, Joseph, arrived just after sunrise, his eyes wide the moment he stepped inside Susan's tent. He had worked in the reserve for 20 years and thought he had seen it all: leopards stealing chickens, baboons hijacking a tourist van, but nothing prepared him for the sight of a retired American woman swaddling a lion cub beside a small campfire. He dropped to his knees in silence, taking in the scene, the tiny rise and fall of the cub's chest, the mud on Susan's clothes, and the raw emotion in her eyes. "Where is the pride?" he asked quietly, as though raising his voice might summon them. Susan explained everything: how she pulled the first cub from the river, how the lions came, and how the mother had taken it gently without harming her. Joseph listened with a face carved in stone, then slowly shook his head. "You should not be alive," he said, "but maybe they knew." She didn't ask what he meant. She just looked back at the cub, now resting its head against her boot. Joseph examined the cub gently. It was malnourished, weak, but not beyond saving. "We have to act fast," he said. "If it doesn't eat soon, it will not make it." He rummaged through his gear, pulled out a cloth-wrapped bundle, and began mixing a formula. Susan held the cub as Joseph used a small dropper to feed it. It struggled at first, then laxed, instinct guiding its tiny jaws. Watching it fight for life cracked something wide open inside her. By noon, the cub had more color in its ears. It could lift its head, barely, and blink with purpose. Susan hadn't slept, but she didn't care. Every second felt sacred. Joseph stepped outside to make a discreet call to a friend at a wildlife research outpost. They would come at dusk with no uniforms, no rangers, just two scientists who might help return the cub to the wild without raising alarm. It was their only chance to make this right. The research team arrived in a dusty truck just as the sun began to fall. Two women, both young, soft-spoken, and visibly moved by Susan's story, entered the tent and knelt beside the cub. "You gave it a name?" one of them asked. Susan hesitated, then nodded. "I called him Dave." Her voice cracked. "Not because he's like my husband, but because I think he would have wanted me to fight for him, too." The scientists exchanged a glance, then smiled. "David is." The plan was bold. At first light, they would locate the pride by tracking the original cub, if they were lucky, and carefully return the second. But it had to look natural. If the lioness sensed human scent, or danger, she might reject the cub or worse. The women gave Susan instructions on how to carry the cub wrapped in savanna grasses, how to avoid eye contact, how to retreat without turning her back. Susan memorized every word. She would not fail this. That night, Susan stayed awake again, this time whispering to the cub, telling him everything she wished she could have told her husband before he passed. She cried, not quietly. The scientists let her be. They understood. Grief needs an outlet, and sometimes that outlet is a pair of golden eyes that don't blink when the tears come. By dawn, the cub stirred, stronger, steadier, ready. They found the pride a mile from the river, resting under a low acacia tree. The mother was there, recognizable by a small scar on her hip, and beside her, the original cub, alive and well. Susan's heart leapt. Joseph stayed back while the scientists helped her prepare. She wrapped little Dave in dried grass, held him to her chest, and walked slowly, carefully toward the clearing. Her hands shook. Every step felt like a prayer. When she was close enough to see the lioness's breath, she stopped. The lion stirred. The mother lifted her head. The cub let out a single, soft cry. The sound was faint but unmistakable. The lioness stood. Susan bent down, placed the cub on the grass, and backed away, eyes down, just as instructed. For a moment, no one breathed. The lioness approached, sniffed the cub, and after what felt like forever gently lifted him into her mouth. The pride closed around her. Then they vanished into the tall grass, as if nothing had happened. But Susan knew better. Everything had changed. Back at camp, no one spoke for a long time. Susan sat on an overturned crate, eyes fixed on the horizon where the lions had disappeared. Her hands were still trembling, but inside, something had shifted. For the first time in almost a year, her chest didn't feel so tight. She breathed deeply, really breathed, and realized how long it had been since she'd felt grounded in her own skin. Joseph handed her a cup of tea without saying a word. He didn't need to. They both knew what they'd just witnessed was rare and sacred. The scientists packed their gear with care, but one of them lingered. She told Susan that stories like this were almost never shared because people would think they were made up. "But it happened," she said. "And the way you moved, how the mother accepted you. That wasn't just instinct, that was trust." Susan smiled faintly. "I think she knew I'd lost something, too. It wasn't about science anymore. It was about something older than that, grief, recognizing love." In the days that followed, Susan stayed at the reserve longer than planned. She didn't join the scheduled safaris or pose for photos. Instead, she spent her mornings by the river, sketching in her notebook, listening to the birds, waiting. She never saw the pride again. But once, early in the morning, she found fresh paw prints near the riverbank, small, round, side by side. She smiled, pressed her palm into the earth beside them, and whispered, "Be good, Dave." Back home in Minnesota, the silence no longer crushed her. She framed a photo of the river and placed it beside the urn on the mantel. She didn't need to explain it to her children. They saw it in her eyes, the peace, the presence, the quiet joy that had returned. Susan joined a local wildlife conservation group, sharing her story with schools, retirement homes, and online communities. She never exaggerated. She didn't need to. The truth was powerful enough. The story spread, first locally, then beyond. A small wildlife blog picked it up. Then a documentary crew called. Susan turned them down at first. It wasn't about attention. But eventually, she agreed if they told the story right. Not about danger or drama, but about connection. about a woman broken by loss, and a lioness who didn't see a threat, but something familiar. The film aired on public television under the title Trust in the Tall Grass, and it touched hearts across the country. People wrote letters, dozens, then hundreds. A widower in Texas who'd lost his wife and hadn't left the house in a year. A grandmother in Ohio who watched the film with her grandson and cried for 2 days. A veteran in Arizona who said he finally understood what healing might look like. Susan read each letter with quiet gratitude. She answered as many as she could. She understood now this wasn't just her story anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever loved and lost. The Wildlife Reserve invited her back the next year, not as a tourist, but as a guest speaker for their conservation education program. She walked back into the same grasslands, older, steadier, but no less in awe. She carried only a small pack, her husband's binoculars, and a notebook. At the end of her talk, someone asked if she ever feared the lions would turn on her. She smiled. "Not once," she said, "because sometimes, even wild things know who's come in peace." Back in Minnesota, Susan took up drawing again, mostly animals. She started with lions, not fierce or snarling, but resting in the sun, nuzzling their young. She gifted her first finished sketch to Joseph, who hung it proudly in the ranger's lodge. Her home was filled with quiet reminders, paw print pendants, field guides, letters from strangers who felt seen. Her days had rhythm again, purpose. And that yawning silence, it was gone. She never stopped missing Dave. That kind of love doesn't vanish. But now, it lived alongside something new, a story of survival, of trust, of two lost souls who met by a river in the wild heart of Africa. And when people asked her what really happened that day, she would pause, look out the window, and say, "I didn't just save a lion cub. That lioness saved me, too." And maybe, in a world full of noise, that quiet miracle was all the proof anyone needed.